Welcome to the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast. I'm your host, Various Artists, and please join me as I travel back and revisit every live show I've seen from 1975 to the present. Have you ever had that feeling upon hearing something for the first time where it felt both completely new yet inexplicably familiar, and in a metaphysical sense rather than a stylistic one? You know, some elemental sense of deja vu, something that you instinctually feel deep inside. That was my reaction upon hearing the debut album from today's concert headliner. Hey everyone, I'm your host, Various Artists. Welcome back for another installment of the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast series, and it's episode 18, concert number 12. And today I'm looking back on one of the very best and most exciting concerts I ever saw, The Clash, with Black Uhuru, CNE Grandstand, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, Sunday, September 5th, 1982. And this episode is titled Clash City Rockers. Welcome back once again for return listeners, and a big welcome to first-time listeners. Also today with me once again is going to be my pal, special guests from Leeds, UK, but we knew each other from many years ago when he lived over in this London, Ontario, Canada. And special guests has been my special guest for a number of episodes. But today is exciting. He's revealing his real name. His identity is revealed. So anyway, that's exciting and coming up. And also, he has some memories of the day and also of seeing Joe Strummer another time. And so anyway, stick around for that. Also, there's going to be a little vignette at the end of the episode of a very different musical memory from that day for me that occurred after the concert and in the CNE Midway, and also tells the story of where Lady B's name comes from. It has to do with a record purchase after the concert, so just a lot of excitement for today. I'd like to remind listeners to check out the MyLifeInConcert.com blog, where the original 2012 blog entry for this story is housed, and you can read. There's additional details, plus ephemera, pictures of records, scans, the original tickets there, related videos, that sort of thing as well. Also, I have a number of Spotify playlists up, but I've got two specifically that are up there in conjunction with today's episode. The first one is, and all of my Spotify playlists begin with MLIC and then a prompt. So it's MLIC prompt, Clash City Rockers, VA's Fave, Deep Cuts, B-Sides, Outtakes, Live Tracks, etc. So basically not the hits that you're used to hearing, and maybe live versions of some of the hits that are there. So, but the more obscure tracks or deep cuts that I like. Also, because Black Uhuru were the opening band, and also, as we'll talk about, did an amazing show, I decided to put up, actually this is the reggae playlist that I had made for myself some time back, and I've now put a title on it, put it live. So it's MLIC prompt, Youth of Eglinton, VA's reggae favorites from the 60s and 80s. So just a lot of my favorite tracks, especially a lot of 70s, but some 60s, some 80s. And I'm calling it Youth of Eglinton because, of course, that is one of Black Uhuru's most famous song from the album Red, which they did perform at the concert. So anyway, those playlists are there, embedded in the blog entry or on Spotify. Anyway, check them out if you're interested. And also with the blog, there's lots of entries from shows from the 70s through the 2010s. So anyway, more to check out if you're interested. Also, please like, follow, and subscribe where appropriate to find out about new episodes with our Facebook and Instagram pages. And check out our YouTube channel, where there's clips of stuff I've shot at gigs, as well as now I'm starting to put up little clips from stuff I taped on video almost 40 years ago. And I've just put up a Stiv Bators interview from 1983 that I've called Stiv Bators Starring in the Ultimate 3-Minute Rock and Roll Interview. And it's from Toronto's New Music 1983 interview when he was in Lords of the New Church. Of course, he'd also been the lead singer in the Dead Boys, one of the first U.S. punk bands. And Again, it's 3 minutes. It's priceless. And what's priceless about it is Stiv sitting there just very matter-of-factly tossing off stories about, partying with the band and throwing furniture in the hotel fireplace and the hotel catching on fire, or, 6 bouncers coming out to dance on him, as he put it, or, sleeping chained to a radiator with a cop on either side of the bed. Anyway, just like it's a normal day at the office. Anyway, go check it out. It will brighten your day. All right, so back to the matter at hand. Now, for those of you who have been listening, you'll know that I have a lot of love for a lot of different artists. But with The Clash, it would be difficult to overstate just how obsessed I was with them during the period of their existence, that late 70s, early 80s lifespan. Now, as I mentioned in episode 12 on Seeing the Jam in Toronto in April of 79, that during that, say, 78 to 82 period, my favorite band in the world, it was kind of a toss-up between the Jam and the Clash, and Joy Division entered in there somewhere. But the point of it is there was so much amazing music at the time. It was an incredible time. There were a lot of bands, but the Clash were extra special to me. This 1982 concert was the one and only time I got to see them live, and was easily the most anticipated show I'd attended up until this point. Now, I don't want to rehash too much for those who have been listening since the beginning, but basically, I talked a lot about this in the episode, actually the one on Bob Seger. I think it's episode 7, which is actually more about discovering punk rock than Bob Seger. And the ones on Elvis Costello, the Jam, also the one on the local shows by NFG, the Sinners and the Regulators. I've talked about this, how I had been following punk from a distance, first through Rock Scene magazine, starting in 1974, reading about Patti Smith and this band, the Raymanees, which, as it turns out, was the Ramones. And I cover that off in episode 3 about seeing them in 1980. But the short of it is I was following from a distance before I'd heard any of these bands. And then 2 years later, I was reading about all this in the British music press, and then the 100 Club Punk Rock Festival, and I was just thought, this is incredible, what's happening. And again, it had a pull for me before I even heard the music, but when I did start to really hear it in 77, it immediately was something I connected to and started buying the records by all the main bands, and hearing them, other people around me too were having these records. So I was hearing a lot of these bands, playing a lot of these bands, and of course the Clash were one of the main groups of that first wave of the UK scene, kind of like the second band or whatever after the Sex Pistols. But for whatever reason that is completely lost to me now, they were actually one of the last groups of that initial sort of era from New York or London where I bought their album. They were one of the last of sort of the first group. I don't know why. I have no idea why. And the thing is, here in Canada, that first Clash album was issued exactly as is. It wasn't in the States, and it didn't come out until 79, and then it was in a really chopped up fashion. But that original undiluted British debut was issued here this exactly the same time in Canada. So it had been on the market, and I'd seen it, and I knew about them, and I'd heard about them, but for whatever reason, I always had something else better to buy. And I've thought about this. Why did I then go get the album? And in thinking through, I think I got the chronology, is in the later summer of 78, I had an aunt and uncle who would frequently come over from the UK, and on one of their visits, they wanted to go to Florida. It was off season, but still, so we went to Florida. They wanted to go. And we went down in August, and for the trip down in this cramped car, I was going to have my little mono tape deck, and I could tape from the outputs of the stereo into the deck, so it'd be direct, but it would still just be a mono signal. But, you know, I'm a teenager, we're going down, that's the technology of the time. So I think I taped about, say, 14 albums and maybe a compilation on a bunch of 90-minute cassettes to take down. And most of it was what I was listening to at the time, you know, punk and new wave, and of course the Rolling Stones' Some Girls, which that was my album of that summer. But I think I taped some sort of older wave albums, and it was just like this. I just wanted to hear the new stuff. And also, when I was in Florida, we went to a bookstore and I bought a copy of Carolyn Coon's book, 1988. Now, this was a collection of her essays and interviews from Melody Maker, sort of as punk was happening, and she was one of the first people reporting on it. And I read that book while I was down there listening to these cassettes in Florida while enjoying the beach and that. But I became obsessed. I read the interviews with The Clash, and I thought, I have to get this album. Why haven't I picked up this album? And it became like, I just want to go back home now to buy this album, even though it had been there on the racks for me to buy for about a year and a quarter. So I think it was the day after I got back, I went down to Records on Wheels and bought it. And brought it home, put it on the family hi-fi, and I put headphones on. I sat in front of the stereo with the headphones on, plugged in, and I played this album. And, here's the thing about creative experiences and responses to creative experiences. They are experiences. And it's hard for me to put into words, because ultimately at the end of the day, some experiences you can try to describe them and try to put them into words, but some things are just completely ineffable. It's pure experience. I recognize that, I was coming from a very different place than these musicians, geographically and culturally. But the words and the music on this album, it just tapped into something deep within me. It was articulating thoughts and feelings viscerally and verbally with the great lyrics of stuff I was just starting to grasp, but it just connected with me. And it's one of those experiences where you feel like this was almost made for you to listen to. Sitting there in that daze after my first listening, I thought this was the best rock and roll album I had ever heard. And while I may not see it as the best, I still see it as one of the very best. And it was shortlisted on my top 15 albums list that's on the site. But, I've never really stopped playing it. There's never been a time, maybe I might play it more than others, but I've never really stopped listening to it. As I mentioned, it articulated something deep inside, and it was the spirit, and that's something we'll be talking about later with special guests. Just the spirit that comes through. And, it was just this incredible record to hear. Again, this was still kind of new after years of a lot of long tracks. It was this breathless succession of sharp, smart, ultra-hooky tunes. 13 were original. They were tight, focused, original tunes broken by an extended reimagining of Junior Murvin's 1976 reggae hit Police and Thieves, which I didn't know at the time. Years later, of course, I would hear it, and I've heard it a million times. It's one of my favorite reggae tunes. But I didn't know it, but I knew of it, and I knew what they were doing. And like right from the get-go, the Clash were coloring outside of the lines. They weren't adhering to any... Even though that first album is almost like a blueprint for a certain type of punk rock, even then they weren't allowing those limitations on their expression. And I just love the mix of the aggressive musical urgency with smart, sharp lyrics. And, there was the political and the personal. And as I've said in this and other episodes, while I love the idea of political music, and some have done it well, a lot of it doesn't always come off as, it comes more strident, or the focus is on the message rather than a tune. But the Clash were one of those bands who just pulled it off. They could do it, and it worked. This was a band that was deadly serious about their mission, and they meant it, and it just jumped off the disc. Now, another favorite artist of mine who has, I've already talked about 2 shows by him, that's Elvis Costello. In episode 8, I talked about seeing him with the Attractions here in London in 78. And then also in episode 10 for concert number 8, the amazing show, the headlining show that he played at the Heatwave Festival in 1980. And in 2015, he wrote his memoirs. It's a great book, Unfaithful Music and Disappearing Ink. I would highly recommend it. And famously, he wrote Watching the Detectives, certainly one of my favorite Elvis Costello songs. And the first Elvis, no, I heard the first album in a record store, but I remember hearing that. I've talked about hearing that song up in Cumbria. And I just want to read from his book. This is what he had to say about the Clash album and how it influenced him. And he said, I'd written the song, Watching the Detectives, in my front room in Witten, fueled by nothing stronger than a jar of instant coffee after listening repeatedly to the first album by The Clash for what I told people was 36 hours, but was definitely all the way through one completely sleepless, caffeinated night. I was trying to work out why the flimsy but furious sound of this record, with its siren guitars and square, dry drumming, could come across as so powerful. I was trying to gather up the words that the singer sprayed out, sounding hoarse and sometimes as if he were wearing an ill-fitting boxer's gum shield. What were they doing covering another recent reggae release? I'd read about Police and Thieves and even managed to pick up a 7-inch single of the Junior Mervyn original, tossed carelessly into a cutout bin of disco singles. Now here it was among the Clash's own songs. It was like finding Do Right Woman, which I thought of as an Aretha song on the Gilded Palace of Sin by the Flying Burrito Brothers. It was totally out of place with the rest of the material and made perfect sense at the same time. So that was a quote from Elvis Costello's Unfaithful Music and Disappearing Ink about his initial impressions upon hearing the first Clash album. So, it's late 1978. I finally bought and heard the Clash album, and it was an overnight obsession, total religious conversion. And one of the first things was I ordered the Complete Control single. Now, in between their first and second album, they issued a series of 3 singles that really solidified their power and expanded their musical language. And the first was Complete Control in September of 77. And it was basically a raspberry hurled at their record company for having pulled the song Remote Control as a single without getting their okay on it. And I ordered it from one of those mail order places in the back of the NME, along with, and that single was a year old at the time. And I ordered that and the brand new Buzzcocks album, Love Bites. And I was hoping they would show up before Christmas, and they didn't. And I thought maybe they weren't going to show up at all. But eventually, in early January, it showed up, and I just loved Complete Control so much. And I just played that and City of the Dead, the B-side, so much. And in the meantime, they'd also brought out the anthemic Clash City Rockers, which was their first reworking of The Who's I Can't Explain. The second was Give 'Em Enough Ropes, Drugs on the Roof. It's either that they're rewriting or The Kinks the hard way, one of the two. And then White Man and Hammersmith Pele, another huge favorite. And that was their first original number that incorporated reggae aspects into the song. So I had catching up to do from what they'd released in the interim. Also, they were about to issue their second album, Give 'Em Enough Rope. And that didn't get released domestically over here until it was like the very end of January, or the last week in January or first week in February. That's how I remember it, in 1979. And that weekend that album came out, that is, again, such a memory that's burned in my mind, because by this point, my elder siblings and siblings-in-law had really become enmeshed in the local London punk scene. And so there was a lot of parties in that vein going on there. Also, my sister-in-law's hair salon, basically the back room turned into this impromptu party place for the punk scene and that. So I was too young to get into the bars, but I was partying with a lot of these people much older than myself in these environments. And that weekend, there was a bunch of stuff that went on. That album came out, and it's literally every single person I knew in that scene, including myself, bought that album that weekend. And it's just this memory of a lot of fun stuff, a lot of fun times, this whole scene just starting to take shape in London, and playing this album over and over. I've never been a fan of Sandy Pearlman's dense, claustrophobic production on Give 'Em Enough Rope. It's like it doesn't stop exploding sonically. There's no space in the recording, which is a big contrast with the simple, direct minimalism of that first Clash album. And actually, that's another thing. When I heard it, it was a bit of a shock to hear that album at the time, because it sounded like a demo. And this is in the middle of that, that whole era of those predominantly wet California style, effects heavy productions. And instead you had this dry demo sort of approach to the sound, and it was just immediate and urgent and right in your face. There's breathing room in the music. Same with London Calling and Guy Stevens' production, although that's a much more fulsome and warm production. But still, that's the one thing. I love Give 'Em Enough Rope. I love the songs, but it's hard to love that very sort of American-style production that Sandy Pearlman stamped on that album. Actually, the highlight of that weekend, and this ties in a bit with episode 13, the one I did on the local bands, What's in the City, is I got to go to a party they were called the Punk Cowboys House, and it was a couple of guys who had this house they were sharing in this subdivision, and they were early people, part of the punk scene, and it was this Sunday afternoon party going on in their basement with this band playing who either turned into NFG or were NFG at the time, and it was just craziness and in the middle of the afternoon, and it's just so much surrounding my life, and that sort of vanilla North American mainstream culture felt so alienating to me. And being surrounded by these interesting and sometimes a bit crazy people enthused on the fast, aggressive music and life, well, this just felt simpatico to me. So my Clash obsessiveness took off, and by the time of this gig in 1982, they had released 3 albums in the interim. Now, of course, they'd released what I call their second true classic, and probably their most classic album, the double LP London Calling, in December of '79. And we're going to talk about this later with special guests, and it's an album I just never get tired of listening to. And again, I have a distinct memory of hearing it, because the first import copies hit London, Ontario on December 24th, 1979. And I went downtown late that afternoon because actually there was a party going on in the back room of the hair salon. I'd been tipped, come on down. And I stopped in at Records on Wheels on the way, and I walked in and I heard Joe Strummer's voice, and it's like, here it is. And I just read the review the week before in the NME, and I remember it was the right profile, and it was that verse about Montgomery Cliff. The song's about Montgomery Cliff, but Montgomery's head is found broken on a wheel. That was the first moment I heard of that album. And I just stayed in the store to listen to the rest of the side. It was Lost in the Supermarket and Clamped Down and then Guns of Brixton. I'm like, oh my God, this is fantastic. And I went up to the salon. The party was going on, and my soon-to-be brother-in-law, who just started going out with my sister, had just picked up an import copy, and they were playing it up at the store. So I got up there and heard it, a chunk of it up there as well. So that's a really nice memory. London Calling broadened their musical palette wildly. It was also a big hit here in Canada, just missing the top 10, although Sandinista went on to do even better and hitting number 3. But also, between the second and third albums, Give 'Em Enough Rope and London Calling, they issued the Cost of Living EP in the spring of 1979, and I picked that up during the summer. And it's got that version of I Fought the Law on it, but it had 2 new tunes, Groovy Times and Gates of the West, which were a real stylistic departure for the band. I thought, oh, okay, this is different, this is new. And then when London Calling came out, it was just a complete expansion of their sound that they had begun on this interim EP. Of course, expanding their sound really exploded on their next album, Sandinista, from December of 1980. And that's always a controversial one and sort of a one that splits the audience. I love the album. Admittedly, yeah, it's 3 albums and it's long. It's 2.5 hours. Of course, there's filler on there. But some people's filler are other people's highlights. And the good and great stuff on there, I often think underrated. And a lot of it was years ahead of their time. That's the Clash's Trippy album. And it's interesting because I recently replayed the whole thing from start to finish. I was doing a lot of baking, how domestic, and I always like to have music on when I'm doing that. And I actually had it on a playlist with albums. I can't remember what was on before it, and it just came on, and I thought, oh, I'm going to listen to this. And I listened to it all the way through, all 6 sides, and I absolutely loved it. Now, they followed Sandinista with the Radio Clash EP, but their next LP proper was Combat Rock, which came out again. I remember this clearly in the spring of 1982. Now, it was initially supposed to be a double album entitled Rat Patrol from Fort Bragg, but wisely, I believe, it was whittled down to a single disc. They needed to rein things in after the excess of Sandinista. And it was certainly a lot more accessible than its predecessor, and of course featured the big hits to be Rock the Casbah and Should I Stay or Should I Go. But it still has some of Sandinista's wonderfully bizarre touches. There's songs about Lauren Bacall and a traffic jam, and Errol Flynn's Lost in Vietnam Son. Of course, Allen Ginsberg drops by for some beat poetry and a Buddhist mantra. And also there's like the T-Rex-ish Adam Tan, which is a bit different from anything they'd done before. And what is Death is a Star? I don't even know what genre you would call that. Anyway, that was the album that came out in the spring, and that is the album they were touring on. One thing I would like to say, though, is next year is the 40th anniversary of Combat Rock. Please, whoever it is that would be involved in making this decision, can we have a deluxe Combat Rock? Can we have the album as they initially intended, with bonus tracks? Now, some of those tracks have come out. They're on Sound System, but the album was never released in the form they initially intended. So that would be really cool. I don't know if Sony is still overseeing this, but whoever is involved, it would really be cool to have the original album for the 40th anniversary. So I knew they'd be touring. I was saving up my pennies. And the moment this concert was announced, it was like, I'm going. And again, I went with Lady B and Le Chateau. And I've, of course, in episode 16, we all saw, the three of us, well, Lady B and I saw our first gig in the summer of 81, Police Picnic 81, which I covered in episode 15. And then in episode 16, it was the three of us went to see OMD. And the three of us through this year went and saw a number of gigs together. So we saw OMD. Then we went to the Police Picnic 82, which I covered in episode 17, which was a nightmare. And here we were going back to the CNE just a few weeks later for a very different and more positive experience. And while all three of us were excited to be going, and all three of us were fans, particularly even more of the two Lady B, for me, the Clash were a religion. Now, as I mentioned in episode 10, once again on the Heatwave Festival, I was supposed to have seen the Clash in 1980 at that festival. They were the headliners, and they pulled out, and I've never been able to get a clear reason why, but that was disappointing. So I didn't get to see them then. I was bound and determined I was going to see them this time, even though I was disappointed that Topper Hedden had been fired or quit just before, and they brought in the original drummer, Terry Chimes, from the first album. So it was kind of cool that they brought him on board, but I would have much preferred to have seen Topper Hedden. He's such an amazing drummer. Now, there's also the matter of the opening act, Black Uhuru. This has got to be one of the best double bills I've ever seen. Not got to be, it is. It was one of the best double bills I ever saw. And particularly in the late 70s and early 80s, I was listening to a lot of reggae, and I still listen to a lot of reggae from the 60s, 70s, 80s. And as I mentioned, there's that Youth of Eglinton playlist. But at the time, Black Uhuru were one of my favorites. And that year, the year before, they put out the album Red, which I particularly loved and was playing. So I was super excited that they were on the bill. And I'll be talking about that a little bit later with special guests in the latter part of the interview. So I titled this episode Clash City Rockers in terms, both after the Clash single and the Clash being a rock band, but there's also rockas in the reggae sense, which sort of Black Uhuru represents in the title. So let's continue on with the interview with special guests, revealing his name and talking about his memories of the band and of the concert. So I'm here once again with special guests who has appeared on so many episodes and will be in many upcoming. And again, I've been using pseudonyms for people because I had lost contact with so many people and just to not impinge on privacy. So special guest is the name I've been giving, but because special guests is here and now, I'm going to call him by his real name, which is Phil Robinson. Revealing. So today we're going to talk about, I know for myself, this is one of the best concerts I ever saw, and it's The Clash.
Yeah.
And you were there too. We met about, we're getting closer. It was about 5 or 6 months after this when we met. This is just before.
Yeah.
So I'll start off by asking you, okay, how did you come to know about The Clash? How did you learn about them, their music? How did that happen?
I'm not 100% sure. I think I probably read about them in music magazines before I actually heard them. So I think I first heard them, it was probably about 1979. So I kind of came, a couple of years late from when all the sort of punk stuff kicked off. So I think the first album I got from them as well was London Calling.
Mm-hmm.
I think I didn't get the first 2 albums until after that. So it would have been about 1979 when I first heard them. I don't remember exactly what the first song was I heard. I think I just bought the album, London Calling, completely by chance, probably realizing that I'd probably like it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I've loved it ever since.
Yeah.
It's got to be in my top 3 favorite albums of all time.
I mentioned earlier in the podcast that it is an album maybe there's been sometimes I've played it a little bit more than others, but I really can't remember a time in my life when I have ever not listened to that album.
Yeah.
And every time I put it on, it sounds fresh.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can hear it. It's the spirit. What I want to talk about later is the spirit of the band. Like in the live performance, there was just such spirit, and that spirit really comes through on that album. The first one as well. Because you were 2 years late in for them. I was about a year late, and I talked about that earlier. I didn't get it till 78. But it's the spirit, and it still to this day comes crackling through their recordings to me.
Oh yeah, I agree 100%. Yeah, it doesn't, to me, that album in particular doesn't sound dated in any way at all. London Calling album just doesn't, it still sounds fresh to me as it did then.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I don't think I ever get bored listening to it ever.
No, the songs are so good. Also, in many ways, I mean, they're coming out of punk rock, but that album is almost genreless. And almost every song's a different genre in some way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely, because there's so many different ones on there, which probably makes it timeless in a way.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, because it taps into... It's kind of, for me, also what the Beatles did, where they absorbed all these different types of music that would come out, yet there would still be this strand of the band that ran through everything, yet they could apply... especially at that album, they were just applying so many different types of music styles, yet completely making it their own. It wasn't like they were copying anything.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I really liked about them, was that they didn't just stick to one formula. They didn't think, oh, we've got to make the first album over and over and over again. Every album sounds different.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what kept them fresh. So do you remember hearing about this show or anything about the show, buying the tickets, the lead up, anything of that kind?
I'm not sure when I heard about the show. It could have been in the paper, because they advertised a lot of the CNE stuff, I think, in listings and stuff, and you'd see, who was going to be there. It could have, it could have been anything like that, really. But I didn't get my ticket till really late because I went with Wendy, and she was in Toronto, and I don't know whether she'd already moved to Toronto. No, she couldn't have done. I think she was. I don't know why she was in Toronto first for a while,
just as a time frame, this is 3 weeks after the police picnic.
Oh, is it? Oh, God.
Yeah, 3 weeks between the two gigs.
Wow. Oh, wow. I forgot. That completely left my mind.
Isn't it incredible, like how time stretches and
Yeah, because you don't, yeah. So it was,
retracts?
I know. Oh, wow.
Yes. So this was
But
just a few weeks later. Mind you, I'm wondering, maybe was she moving there for school because this was the Labor Day weekend, and so that's when a lot of students
yeah,
went.
she could have been. She could have been. She did go to school there. She went to art college. So it could have been that. But she called me up and said, there's still some tickets because I hadn't got a ticket. And I think it was probably maybe the week before. And she said, I'll get you a ticket. And I said, great. So then I remember having to ask my dad for some money, which he gave me, but I'd asked for like $50, which was a lot of money back then.
Yep.
So I said, can I have $50? And he was like, oh, God, I only gave you 10. I said, well, that's gone. So, yeah, he gave it to me. So I was like, luckily I had enough money to travel down there on the bus and stay wherever Wendy was staying. I can't remember. And getting the tickets. But we weren't sat together. So we ended up, the lead up for it was, obviously I was ecstatically over the moon. I couldn't wait because they were one of my all-time faves.
Mm-hmm.
But it was funny because I was sat lower down, in the top bit, not the front, not sort of right. Was there a general admission bit or was that?
Oh, yeah. And because unlike you, okay, so the moment I heard about this, I can't remember where and when I heard about the gig, but like you, I'd been obsessive. I even had a year or two on you on my obsession. So when this went out, it's like, I'm going no matter what. As with Police Picnic 2, you went with Wendy and I once again went with Lady B and Le Chateau. And we'll be talking a little bit later on how that Lady B came about. It was after this gig. And I can't really, actually, you know what? I just had a memory flashback right now. I'm just remembering this as we're at the mic. I remember buying the tickets for this show. And I'd heard about it. And same thing too. I wasn't working regularly at that time. I really didn't have a lot of money, but I had been putting some aside because I knew they would be touring. Mm-hmm. And I remember, again, we had just been at the CNE for the first time 3 weeks before that, and I was just starting to learn the process of buying tickets and how to get good tickets. So I was new. I should have gone in right away if I wanted floor seats, but because they had an open floor, but I didn't, and I got tickets in the stand. And I remember going into Sam the Record Man, where I ended up working for many years, several years later. And that was one of the main places to buy tickets at the back. Yeah. And I think I may have been partying with someone that day, so I was already quite merry when I went in to buy them. But that memory just popped in. But I was so disappointed. I wanted floor seats and they didn't have them because, of course, we learned 3 weeks earlier at the police picnic about how there are general admission floor seats and then actual seats on the side. We had learned that the hard way in the previous episode, so we knew this time. Oh, and one other fact that I found out a few years ago doing some research, that this gig, now it was at the CNE Grandstand. The CNE Exhibition Stadium was this huge football stadium that it has 60,000 capacity. Mm-hmm. And the CNE, for those not in the Toronto or Ontario area, is the Canadian National Exhibition. It's a huge fair that's been going on in Toronto for years. It's massive. And they would have a grandstand over the course of the CNE. And the grandstand was about a third of the stadium. That's how it was usually set up. And so the Clash was one of the acts for the CNE that year. And I found out that this gig, which was a sold-out capacity of 19,000 people, was the largest gig largest headlining gig they ever played that wasn't a festival.
Wow. So I didn't know that. That's interesting.
I bumped into that factoid online a few years ago. So that's interesting. But we had the tickets. It was the same three of us. We were just glad we had them.
Mm-hmm. So where were you sat?
since I couldn't get on the floor, I tried to get as close as I could up in the stands and in the middle. So we were not too far up. We had seats. And of course, usually at these things, you have to sit down and blah, 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 or at least stand in your seat. I think the CNE was clued in enough that this wasn't going to be that type of crowd. So what they were actually letting people do, of course, this is a bad fire regulation, no, but they were letting people stand and go down in the middle part in between the seats. So we had seats, but people were just getting up and going down. We thought, well, to hell with this. And we just went down. Basically, if you looked at the entire audience and stadium with quite a large ground area with no seats and then a large seated area, we were almost literally dead center of everything. And the other thing that was good is because we were up in the seats, but we were able to walk down and be on the sort of on the concrete area in between. We were actually not too far above stage level. So if I couldn't be on the ground, which is where I wanted to be, this would probably be the next best place to be because we were dead center, not too far off the height of the stage, and it was right in front of us. So it was a pretty good view for the concert.
Right.
Whereabouts were you sitting?
I was on the left-hand side. I was in the sort of the front row seats.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, which I was like surprised, considering I only got the ticket I think it was a few days before, where Wendy got it for me. And we weren't sat together because she got her ticket first, but she was like 2 rows behind.
I'm wondering if that's probably why you got it, because all the other rows filled up and it left this one empty seat that was probably hard to get rid of.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was all right. It was an okay view. I was I was more excited to actually to be, I wanted to be down the front, of course, but I was just glad I was there.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way, especially watching the crowd when they came on, which we'll get to. It's like, oh, I really want to be down there. And I got much better as we went on in concert going and making sure that happened. But still, I mean, here we are talking about it almost 40 years later. I think both of us I see myself as incredibly lucky to have seen The Clash and lots of other bands from that time. So I'm not going to complain much.
No, I have to agree. I'm just like, I don't know anybody else who's really seen them,
Wow.
And it's over the years, I'm not, the people I've spoken to, I've not met. I'm not that I can remember. I'm sure I must have come across somebody, but I don't think I have. Looking back, I mean, you used to complain that, oh God, there's nothing happening here. It was in London, Ontario, but I saw quite a lot of bands from back then over the years, not just in London, but, Toronto or wherever.
The other thing, too, is London had a thriving local scene, which I was very much part of for well over a decade, but I don't think I fully appreciated what we had and how that was, like, there was a lot of other places in around, like, I don't think Kitchener-Waterloo had a really thriving scene like that.
No,
so
not that I heard. I can't think of, I don't remember anybody saying they did.
Well, I think when that got pointed out to me is there's an amazing book that came out a few years ago, and I've mentioned it, called Treat Me Like Dirt, written by Liz Worth. And it's an oral history of the Toronto punk scene in the 70s, but it starts dipping down into regions and eventually dips down into the London scene. And just, I guess I just hadn't really realized that because everything was in comparison to what was going on in Toronto, which was so much bigger, it's like, okay, well, we've got our little scene, but I don't think I fully realized that this in itself was very unique. So again, I'm very happy that was here and I was part of that. And part of doing this series is trying to shine a light on some of that as well.
Yeah.
So before we get to The Clash, one of the many things about this gig that's so strong in my mind is that this is one of the all-time best double bills I've ever seen, because Black Uhuru opened the show. particularly at that time, that Red album had come out, which I was playing a lot. So I was positively verklempt when I found that they were going to be opening for The Clash. So did you know Black Uhuru at all? Were you a fan at all? Do you have any memories of their set?
I didn't know any of their stuff. I knew the name, but I don't think I'd heard anything, not that I can recall. And the weird thing is, after watching them and really enjoying it, I still have never bought anything by them. It's just
Hoop.
it's a bit weird because I really, really liked their set. I remember, I don't know if it was Sly or Robbie or somebody in the band had taken off his hat thing that he had on, took it off, and then he just started swinging them about. I can remember that.
That's neat. I can't remember that at all.
I remember the crowd going mad crazy as well. He took it off and threw his head back and threw it back down and was throwing his head around, and everybody was going, ah! Loving it.
That's what I remember. The crowd, they got an absolutely massively positive response. Like the whole crowd was with them. And I just remember them on stage, especially the woman who was in the band, Puma Jones, and she was kind of dancing through the whole thing, and you could just see they were beaming because like the band was on fire. Also, you mentioned Sly and Robbie, Sly Dunbar and Robbie Shakespeare. Okay, I knew they played on the record. I just about crapped myself when they walked out on the stage. I had no idea that they would actually be there. One of the greatest rhythm sections ever. So that for me is one of the greatest memories of that day. It's like, holy shit, it's Sly and Robbie.
Yeah.
And the band was amazing. You could tell they were into it. The audience was into it. It was just an incredible, incredible set.
Yeah.
And of course, it didn't hurt that their best known song was Youth of Eglinton, named after the street and part of Toronto.
Yeah, I didn't know that until you mentioned it.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, it's weird. I find it strange. Even I've never bought any of their stuff. Even after that, it's weird because I used to, if I saw a band and I liked them, if I didn't have any of their stuff, I'd go and buy it. So I don't know why I didn't with that. I don't know.
I had 3 other albums. The best, well, it's on, you've got Spotify. Check out Red. That's one of my favorite reggae albums ever. I've also put up, I mentioned this earlier, a playlist to go with this called Youth of Eglinton, and it's a couple of hours of my favorite reggae from the 60s, 70s, and a bit of the 80s.
All right.
That's on there. And speaking of this, have you seen that movie Lovers Rock that just came out? The Steve McQueen film, part of the Small Axe series?
No.
Oh, well, we're just on the topic of this, and to any listeners, I cannot recommend this enough. It's about 70 minutes long. Essentially, it takes place in one evening at a blues. Those were the reggae house parties they had in London, England at the time. And it's just about an evening in this part. I've watched it 3 times. It's one of the best things I've seen, and it's so original. And the story and the characters are so good. And, of course, the music is amazing. But for yourself and anyone listening, yeah, it's called Lovers Rock, and it's one of the best things I've seen in years. So anyway, Black Uhuru were amazing. They got called back for an encore. It was great. That was a headlining set in itself that I would pay for. And then the wait was on for The Clash, which it's like it's like, I want to see them now.
Yeah.
Do you have any memories waiting for the band? Because I have a very distinct one from the day, but just do you yourself have any memories waiting for them or that sort of thing?
No.
I know. It must have been strange, too, that you were a couple of rows of that, especially in that sort of situation, that you were a couple of rows away.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of sucked that we weren't I wasn't sat with the person I went with. And I don't think there was anybody sort of really wanting to shift, probably. I don't know whether we asked anybody if they wanted to move, but everybody was with it. There wasn't anybody on their own, so yeah. But I don't have it. I probably became impatient, wanting to see them right this minute now. Please, can you come on?
Yeah. Oh no, that's exactly how I was feeling. That's how I remember it as well. But for me, there was a big musical experience that happened for me in between the two sets. And in between the sets, they were playing, it was pretty much all groove music. It was either like funk, rap, reggae, dance music, R&B. And of course, that's the kind of stuff the Clash had been heading into. And this was the early days of rap. And I really liked a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the early rap. And we'd all, mostly though, rap had been party music, like Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang or The Breaks by Curtis Blow or
Mm-hmm.
a dance tune like, Planet Rock, Africa Bambaataa. And this song came on over the PA. And immediately, because I was there with Lady B and Elsie, and all three of us sort of really zoned into this song. And it was this rap song. And it was sort of like this episodic series of things going on in a city. And it was very much a cultural commentary, which was really unusual for
Mm-hmm.
rap at that point in time. It kind of, what brought mine to me was sort of a rap version of Stevie Wonder's Living for the City. And
Mm-hmm.
we really got into it. And the chorus, we thought it was called Don't Push Me because the chorus kept saying, don't push me because I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. And we thought, okay, that's the chorus. And we really got into this song. And I thought, this is
Mm-hmm.
incredible. And I kind of banked it. And that was like, I have to find out what this song is. And it was about 3 weeks after this gig. I was
Mm-hmm.
actually doing the dishes after dinner, and I had CHRW on, which was the local college station, which I would soon be joining for 8, 9 years. And the song came on. I was like, oh my God, this is it. This is the song I heard at the Clash concert. And I just ran to the phone and called the DJ like, who is this?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, okay, this is the message by Grandmaster Flash. And I knew there'd been that song, Adventures on the Wheels of Steel. I thought, oh, okay, what's the same guy, but this had a rap over it. The other one was more that montage. And I thought, okay, wow. And I remember telling it to Le Chateau, and he immediately got the 12-inch single. And that for me is one of the songs of that time, the fall of
Mm-hmm.
'82. And I still think it's an incredible song, even though there's homophobic language in there, which I'm not giving a pass on, which has always pissed me off. But I don't believe in totally canceling everything because of one thing and instead bringing up it as a point to talk about. But
Yeah.
that's a special musical memory for me from the day
I
that
can
it was.
remember after we met, us singing it or rapping it or whatever on the bus.
Yes, do you know what that was?
But that was what I
Cavalcade.
forgot what it was. What?
Cavalcade.
That's it. I couldn't remember the name.
It was this thing they used to have in London, and we
Yeah.
went for several years, and we brought you guys along. Mark Drew also came with us. I think Penny was there too.
Okay.
And it was all of the sort of like the Dutch club and the German club and
Yeah.
the Polish club. All of these clubs would put on sort of like local food and booze, especially the booze. And you would go on a bus and it would be like touring the world sort of thing. And we were all going from one place to another, and we all started doing the message, and the whole bus was clapping along and getting into it. I'm glad you remember that as well.
Don't remember them clapping along, but I can remember us all doing it. I think we were sat at the back, weren't
We were
we?
at the back. Oh no,
Yeah.
as we went along, people got into it because there was about 6 of us back there, and eventually they were clapping along. I have a very vivid memory of this. As we got more and more people sort of got it, because of course everyone was just pissed out of their mind.
Yeah.
That's eventually what ended Cavalcade. Is it turned into just a complete drunk fest with a lot of fights, and they had to shut it down.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. So it was kind
Yeah.
of when it was still sort of a balance, but yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
And so finally, eventually, the Clash came on the stage. Do you have any memories of that?
When they first came on, I just remember being really overly excited to sing along to every single song that they did. Was it London Calling was the first one, wasn't it?
Yeah, you got it. London Calling was the opener.
Yeah.
And I just remember myself and the entire place going nuts.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I
But
wrote in the, go ahead.
but see, I'm just trying to remember other songs. I remember the gig and I remember that song and I remember White Riot at the
Yeah.
end.
Yeah, which kind of surprised me. Well, actually, what really surprised me is the amount of earlier material that they did, which I was very happy about. Like, especially from the first album, they did a chunk of the first album, yet they only did 4 songs from Combat Rock, which is surprising.
That was the album at the time, isn't it?
Yeah, they were touring that
Yeah,
album.
it
It had
took me
come out
touring it,
in
yeah.
May. So this is like 4 months after the album came out.
Mhm.
What I have written down here is if one could have harnessed the energy and excitement saturating that huge crowd, I dare say it could have powered the entire North American Eastern Seaboard for the duration of the concert. It
Oh,
was
yeah.
just so much. We were talking about spirit. And one of the things I took away from this gig is, you sometimes see bands and it's like they're going, not always, but sometimes you've seen them where they're kind of going through the motions or half so. This
Mm.
is the opposite of phoned in. You just feel like they meant every minute they were on stage, and so did everyone in the audience.
Yeah, I mean the crowd was going nuts. The crowd was loving it. So that, I mean, that's probably, obviously came across, which probably made them realize that, the crowd's loving it and they were probably having a good time at the same, as well, which always helps. It's great when you can see somebody and you can see that they're enjoying the gig as well as everybody else is because the performance gets better, I
Yeah.
think.
And of course, with the Clash, I'm not going to see a Clash concert to have a note perfect performance. It's about the spirit and the energy and the expression. They were just on fire. And I remember too, in the middle of the show, Strummer asked for the lights to be brought up in the stadium. And I remember him saying just he wanted to get a look at everyone. It's like, is everyone all right and enjoying themselves? And it's like affirmative on that one, Joe. In terms of the songs, because I actually was able, I think I looked at a set list, but there's a number that I remember from this evening. The positive is they did so much from the first album. The one thing that really disappointed me is they didn't do Complete Control or White Man and Hammersmith Palais or Clash City Rockers, any of those singles. And they really only did one song from, they did English Civil War. So 1978 was largely ignored. But I've got them, yeah, they did Janie Jones, Turn in Vain, The Call Up, Clamp Down, Guns of Brixton with, I'm pretty sure, because Paul Simonon sings that one, Paul Simon and Simonon. And I believe Joe Strummer played bass on that one.
All right. I don't remember.
Bank Robber, Armageddon Time, Police and Thieves, I remember really liking.
You do this is Radio Clash.
Yes, they did. They did that, and also the Magnificent Seven. One of the two of them I remember coming off as a little lumpy live, but the other one worked well. The weirdest song of the entire night for me was they played The Leader off Sandinista, that little 2-minute cut that's near the end of side one. I always thought was a bit of a throwaway, and I thought, wow, they're doing this. That's really strange. But basically, I loved the set. I really remember White Riot at the end because there was a stage rush.
Yes, I remember that. I remember looking and going, geez, because they were tearing down. People were tearing down the combat netting that was in front of the monitors. There was
right,
and there was and people were going mad and pulling it down. I thought, I thought something was going to happen.
Well, I mean, everyone was contained on the floor. And that was a lot of people down there. And again, they were going nuts through the whole thing. And I think that was the last number. Everyone knew it. And it just went boom, mayhem. They were all on the stage. I'd actually forgotten, too, what you just mentioned is that whole sort of camouflage look to the stage and the netting. I'd forgotten that. But now that you mention it, it's come back to me.
Yeah, I can remember that.
The other song I remember and I really remember them singing this, is Career Opportunities. Because first off, I'm glad they did it, Career Opportunities from the first album. But just the irony of the band singing career opportunities to 19,000 people. So,
Yeah.
so they had done well. So I have this down for the end of the show. Following the main set, concluding with a powerful Straight to Hell, they reappeared for a richly deserved and emphatically demanded encore, returning to their first LP and unleashing the other two songs that I most remember from the evening, speeding, chaotic versions of I'm So Bored with the USA and White Riot. And again, the frenzy that had been building all night boiled over, and there was joyous tumult, but just very, very exciting evening.
Definitely, most definitely. I was disappointed when it stopped.
Yes, I can concur. But it's again one of those things when they're on stage, it's almost like you're on a jet that just takes off and you just lose the world outside of anything going on, just ceases to matter and you're focused on the moment.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, definitely.
So you were saying that you saw, because that was it. I never saw The Clash again. And then of course a year later, they kicked out Mick Jones, and for my money, there was a version of The Clash that went on after that, but for me, it wasn't. You can't have The Clash without Mick Jones.
No.
Now, you did say that you saw Joe Strummer again later.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
1999. It was at Glastonbury Festival.
Nice.
It was Joe Strummer and the Mescaleros. So we went along. I think it was on in the middle of the day. It was a hot summer's day. It was a hot Glastonbury the whole weekend. And it was all right. Because every other song was a Clash song. So it'd be like solo Clash, solo Clash, solo Clash, which I was surprised at. I didn't think he would do so many different Clash songs.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm glad he did.
Yeah. So I'm glad he did, yeah. And that was obvious. That was sort of 1999, so that was the last time I saw him. I saw Paul Simonon. I can never say his surname.
I don't know if it's Simonon or Simonon. I've never been sure.
Anyway, I saw him when I was living in London, when he was sat in a car.
Ah.
I was walking past and I looked and I thought, I'm sure that's him. And I looked, sort of made an excuse in my own head to pretend to walk back to where my office was and then walk back again. And I was like, yeah, that's him.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So I was pretty excited. Oh, I'm just seeing him.
So you've seen Terry Hall and Paul Simonon on the streets of London. Anyone else?
The butler from Downton Abbey.
Oh, okay. That we'll get that in there. Maybe he plays harmonica.
Actually, I saw. I'll tell you who I saw, but there was a festival, and it was a short-lived one in Blackheath in London, which is up by Greenwich Park, and it wasn't too far from where we lived at the time. And because we were classified as locals, we got discounted tickets for a couple of years. And we were in. They had, I think, about 2-3 stages, main stage, and we were watching a band from Liverpool that we'd seen before called Stealing Sheep. Mm-hmm. We sort of stood at the back, and I turned around, and Don Letts was stood right behind us.
Oh, cool.
Sort of watching. But, I didn't say anything. I thought, looking? And so somebody else went over and chatted to him and had a selfie with him, and I thought, ooh, I should have done that as well, after the fact. Because he was DJing on the day as well. He was DJing. That's why he was there. And then he also, because where we lived in Deptford, there's a festival called the Deptford and New Cross Free Film Festival. And he directed a film about the Clash. Have you seen it, the documentary?
Yes, I've seen it.
And there was a bar in Deptford High Street called the Job Centre, which used to be a job centre. And they had a free screening of it. And then he was there doing a talk afterwards about the Clash and the film and all that, and then did a DJ set. And it wasn't a big place. It was a bar. I didn't go, but that's another thing.
It would have been a good evening.
It was free.
Oh, the things we pass up.
I know it's weird, isn't it? And then you look back and you think, oh, why did I do that?
Yeah.
There must have been a reason.
Hindsight is 2020.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, look at us today having this conversation.
Mhm.
I mean, the Clash meant so much to me in the 70s and all that. If anything, they're better known and more popular around the world than even during their time. Who would have thought that they would have had this much of a lasting and growing impact? Because at the time, there
Mhm.
was, I mean, they got to be very popular, but still, a lot of the stuff we liked, the idea was, well, this is a load of crap and it's going away. Well, it hasn't worked out that way.
Yeah, I know. It makes you wonder, though, if Joe Strummer was still about, if they would have got back together to do a few shows or whatever.
Well, I know that, was it him and Mick Jones or Paul Simonon? They did do a brief charity set for striking firemen, and I remember seeing a clip of it on television.
Right?
But that would have been shortly before he died.
Mm.
And it was, yeah, a group of firemen. They're doing London Calling. But I really remember the night Joe Strummer died. It would have been depressing nonetheless, but it was right before Christmas
Mm.
2002.
Mm-hmm.
And Cublet and I had just arrived back here in London, because when I was living in Ottawa, for Christmas. And my dad was watching the national. That was CBC's, an evening national news broadcast. And it was just past 10, and I walked into the basement, and my dad was watching the national, and the Clash are on TV. It's like a clip of the Clash. And I'm like, oh, cool. It's a clip of the Clash. And it took me about 5 seconds to realize, wait a minute, this isn't cool. Like someone's died. And then immediately it's like they announced Joe Strummer, and I'm like,
Mm.
oh, God, what a bummer. Because
Yeah.
that totally ended any... You have to have Strummer and Jones to have the Clash.
Oh yeah,
So,
it wouldn't work. It didn't work when Jones left, and it wouldn't work without Joe Strummer at all.
yeah. So I'm so glad, again, that you think of the time and length of the universe and time that has passed. And we both got to be teenagers at the time when the Clash were happening. That's
Mm.
pretty lucky.
Oh yeah, yeah. Because you see, there's videos on. You look at YouTube, and there's videos of younger people now reacting, watching videos or whatever of them, and reacting to them and giving their opinion and all that kind of stuff. And it was nice to know that we actually managed to get to see them live.
Yeah, exactly.
The funny thing as well is like back in 2012, when the Olympics were on in London,
Yeah.
and I was living in London at that time, you heard London Calling all over the place.
Oh, neat.
The BBC used it for when, they were showing the Olympics, they would play London Calling. The big screens that were showing the events, like say in Trafalgar Square, wherever, you'd hear London Calling blasting out.
Neat. I didn't
Yeah,
know
so
that. That's really cool.
that was pretty cool. Because we went to the Paralympics, and you were walking around the Olympic Park, and it's like all the time, all day, every day. So you heard London Calling.
Well, it's a song I don't think I will ever get tired of hearing. So if
Oh
a
no.
song has to be hammered in, that would be a good one.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So after the gig, any
Mhm.
memories of, well, I've got one coming up. Any memories of after the gig for you?
I remember afterwards that we went up on the cable car. We went sort of next to next to the stadium, and you could still see pockets of people still leaving.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's the only thing I remember afterwards. There was no, I don't think, there was nothing special after that, just going on the cable car, and that was about it.
So you didn't sleep in the Henry Moore statue like you did after Peace Picnic 82?
No.
Sculpture, not statue.
No, we didn't. I don't know where. I don't know. We must have gone out. We wouldn't have just gone, back to wherever Wendy was staying. We must have gone into Toronto somewhere.
Well, we headed home after the gig. Now, of course, we had taken Music Man tours last time, and that had gone badly. And generally, though, that really wasn't their fault, but it was the whole thing of being stranded somewhere where you had no other option of getting home. So this time we just took regular Greyhound bus. But of course, as you know, I have one more further magic musical memory from that day. And it was after the gig, the three of us we were walking through the CNE Midway, and there was an area where they had all different stores had stalls. And Sam the Record Man, which I've mentioned before, and for those outside of Canada, Sam the Record Man was one of the biggest and most important record chains in Canada from the 60s through to the 2000s when they closed. And Sam's flagship store in Toronto was at one point historic because there's few stores in the world, especially in the early 60s. There weren't many stores like it that had that level of stock and selection. And anyway, Sam was at this point at the height of being an established retailer, and this was the days of record retail where people were still selling millions of records. And so they had a stall, like a makeshift stall at the fair where they had, popular sellers and stuff like that. And it was also, this was the last night of the CNE for that year. So they had a sale on, they were advertising the sale, buy one record, get a second one free. And so we were looking at that going, we knew right away this is some kind of con job. Of course, this isn't going to be what we think it is. But Lady B decided, I'm going to give this a try just to see like what the deal is, what's the scam, or how does this work? And so as we talked about in episode 16, the three of us went to see OMD together at London, and you were there, and we talked about that. And that had turned Lady B and Le Chateau into big OMD fans. And she'd been buying their albums and also some of the 12-inch singles. And they had, I can't remember which one, but it was one of the 12-inch singles from Architecture and Morality. And they had it for like $225 or something like that. So she said, okay, I'm going to go up with, this 12-inch single, and my free album is going to be Sandinista by The Clash, the triple album, and we knew, we weren't dumb. We knew like this isn't, but at the same time, weirder things have happened in this world. I figured at the very least they'd want her to pay for the more expensive or whatever. So she's in there, she's buying the single, she's checking out, but at the time she's checking out, there was just some people standing in and around, so we couldn't see what was happening. And she came out and she had, this Sam's bag, paper bag. Actually, it was a paper bag. They must have ran out of their iconic plastic bags. And we said, okay, so what happened? Did you get the album? She said, no. And we said, well, what did you get? She says, I don't know. And we were like, well, what happened? And she said, well, I went up with the single and I had Sandinista and I said, I'd like to buy this and this is my free album. And the woman said, your free album is already in the bag. And so she just put it in there and there was already an album in there. And we were like, well, what is it? She goes, I don't know. I haven't been able to open the bag yet. So we grabbed the bag away from her and we thought, what's in here? And we rip it open and we pull it out. And it's the Lady Bump album by Penny McLean, an early Euro disco sensation, which I actually found out because, of course, here in Canada, it was number one and you couldn't get away from it. But it's one of those many records where it was a hit here, but not in the States. I didn't know that till I wrote the blog entry for this Clash show in 2012, and a lot of the people reading and commenting were from America, and they're like, I've never heard of this before, where here you couldn't get away from it. And literally the two of us, Le Chateau and I, when we saw this, we were laughing so hard, we were doubled over. It's that thing where you're starting to be concerned because you can't breathe. You're laughing so hard. And she said, well, and we had it in our hands, so she still couldn't see it. She goes, what is it? What's the album? And we said, Lady Bump. And she went, Lady Bum? And unfortunately, she was teased mercilessly for that. And she was like, I said, how can you forget this? This was like massive in like 75, 76. And she says, well, how did it go? And of course, both of us tried to do that high-pitched I can't, that high pitched screech that is the keynote, which is like the keynote of the song, what everyone remembers. And we just literally couldn't stop laughing. So we got on the bus. We couldn't wait to get home to play this album. And we got back to her place. It was like 3 a.m, I think, and we're just like, we've been partying, and we're just, unlike the CNE, when we were there for the police picnic, which of course in the last episode 17, for those who haven't heard it, it was the worst experience of my life. Everything went wrong. This experience was, everything was amazing. It was a great day. And we came in and we put the record on, and we listened. I think the two of us were rolling around like the living room floor for 40 minutes, almost peeing ourselves with laughter, listening to this album. So that, and anyway, Lady B became associated with the Lady Bump album, and that's why I used that as a pseudonym, because I always have the memory of that, her accidentally buying the album or after the Clash show, and that provided us with many years of entertainment. Actually, I have my own vinyl copy of that album now.
Oh, do you? I was just going to say, I want to try to find a copy if I can.
It's probably on Spotify, but I was like going through used records. I can't even remember where and when I got it, but it was a sealed copy. And everything with the shrink wrap on. So I'm the proud owner of the Lady Bump album. And I have to say, when I put this up too, in 2012, when I first wrote the blog entry, and I did it on Open Salon, and that was this offshoot project from salon.com that ran for a few years, of amateur writers, and that really took off for a few years till they had a lot of technical problems and they had to suspend it. And that's where I initially published all of these pieces and where the audience was, because you got quite a lot of people reading. One of the guys who is also writing is this great guy, and we still interact, and his online name is Chiller Pop. And anything to do with, and he has his own site, chillerpop.com, and anything to do with horror, that is completely his thing. In fact, I will say Chiller Pop is a horror maven. But he was also into a lot of alternative culture and punk bands and loved the Clash. And he read this, and he made 2 comments, because again, he had never heard Lady Bump growing up in the States. And he wrote, "I have to say, Penny McLean and her lovely Lady Bump kind of outshone even the Clash in this post. Her is more ferocious and cacophonous and raw than even White Riot." And then he followed that up. Obviously, he couldn't stop watching the video, and he wrote a little bit later, various artists, because I'm OCD, I had to go and Google and wiki all about Penny McLean. I hope you caught this delightfully demented performance of Lady Bump on YouTube, complete with ginger afro wig and cheap alien landscape set. And is that Audrey too ready to devour her? So anyway, he was amused by that, and did show me this video, which I hadn't seen, and I remember Cublet and I watching it, and Cublet musing. It was a thing from German television. He was like, "Is there a natural fabric in that room?" So for those of you who don't know Lady Bump, you were mentioning those videos that they have of these young people, like reaction shots to these songs. They should do one to Lady Bump.
Oh, yeah, well, no, that would be fantastic. I wonder if there is. I'd have to have a look.
Yeah.
I'm going to research it later.
Yeah, I think I'm going to seek that out. And for those of you who haven't heard it, just do yourself a favor. There's only one recording like this, and that shriek that we're talking about, unfortunately, will be stuck in your head for days. So that was the concert. It was a great one. It was one for the ages. Thanks so much, Phil, Phil, for stopping by once again, taking your time to share your memories. It's greatly appreciated, and really enjoy these chats. And you always have other memories and other shows and stuff. You always bring so many interesting things to the conversation.
Oh, well, that's nice to hear, because sometimes I think I don't.
No, you always have really interesting things to add. And you've been on the last few episodes. Now, you won't be in the next couple, but, well, you weren't there. So, anyway, but
that's
you
no
will
excuse.
There's no, well, you should have been there because they were both great shows. Because Joe Jackson is coming up, and oh god,
Oh,
Iggy
yeah.
Pop and Nash the Slash. That one home. Well, Joe Jackson was great. It was a great night of music, and we'll
Yeah,
be talking about that.
really disappointed I didn't go to that one, but hey ho.
And then the Iggy show. Musically, it was the weakest show I saw Iggy play, but it was probably the most fun. It was just insane. And then I think, yeah, you'll be the one after that because that's the Gang of Four at Wonderland Gardens, and what an amazing show that was. So thanks again, Phil.
No problem. Always happy to help.
And we'll be talking to you soon.
Yep. Okay. See you later.
Well, that wraps up episode 18 and this look back on this highly memorable Toronto Clash show. Please return for episode 19, another in a series of particularly strong shows from this time. It's 1 month after the Clash, and from one Joe to another, I've taken a second, very different 5-star, and this time 3-hour show from Joe Jackson. Once again, the effervescent triumvirate of Lady B, Le Chateau, et moi take in another concert together, one that far surpassed all our expectations. We were expecting really good, but instead got great. The music was ebullient, spirited, and unforgettable, even if a certain someone was intermittently beset by curmudgeonness. This concert also marks my return to Alumni Hall on the campus of Western University for the first time since seeing Elvis Costello and the Attractions there in November of 1978, and that was my concert number 3 that I covered off in episode 8. Luckily, the student rent-a-cops had officially chilled since then. Come back for On-Stage Elbows, the bitter toll of insincere clapping, and going into Another World. That's episode 19, concert number 13, and it's lucky 13 this time as opposed to that disastrous police picnic from episode 17 on Friday the 13th. And it's night and day. Joe Jackson, Alumni Hall, Western University, London, Ontario, Canada, Monday, October 4th, 1982. I'd like to remind listeners once again to check out the mylifeinconcert.com blog site, also my Spotify playlists, which all begin with MLIC, followed by a prompt. And please like, follow, and subscribe to our Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram pages. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. If you've enjoyed the podcast or the mylifeinconcert.com series in general, please pass the word along about the podcast to those who you know, who you think may enjoy it. This is your host, Various Artists, signing off from another episode. Thanks again for listening, and let's meet up at the next show. Bye for now.